Thank you. Does that constitute abuse or bullying? I think so. Kia ora te whanau. So I'm talking about social enterprise, which is kind of just a different way of doing things than fundraising or traditional approaches to resourcing. I would normally do a 3-hour introduction to social enterprise, and I've tried to really slice and dice that into about 9.5 minutes. So let's see what happens. So I'm going to read my notes, because otherwise I will ramble for 3 hours, and we don't have that. So let's start with the basics. I've framed this how to think with a capital T, because I'm not attention to detail. How to think like a social enterprise. So the basics, what is a social enterprise? It's a purpose-driven organization that trades to deliver impact. What that really means, purpose-driven, is that it fundamentally exists to do good. So that speaks of a particular intent and of a mindset rather than like a set of activities or the way that you're structured. It's more about the thinking, what we're trying to achieve. And that pretty much means that there's like an identifiable group of humans whose lives you're trying to make a positive contribution to. This increasingly speaks to a more holistic way of thinking about things, but I'll get to that in a minute. Uses the mechanism of trade, so selling goods and services, doing things that make money. That's the real key distinction between like a social enterprise and your traditional charitable approach, is that you're selling something to a customer. And the customers are paying you to solve a problem, and that problem may or may not be the same problem that you care about. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And lastly, if you put these two things together, you logically start to think, well, any money that we make, you kind of use that to do more good. There are lots of different ways that this can manifest. A lot of discussion says that there can't be private shareholders and you can't have dividends paid, or that certain percentages need to be reinvested in particular activities and those sorts of things. But that's really focusing on the form rather than the function. I think that it's not necessarily always as clear-cut as people try and say it is. But essentially, the use of money should match the intent of the organisation. And that can manifest in lots of different ways, and it should do more good. And transparency becomes quite important with these sorts of things. So in New Zealand, we're still kind of learning what we do and don't know about this stuff. There's a lot that we can learn from the outside, but actually there's a lot that's already here already, and often this is how we frame it up, sort of this notion of a spectrum. At one end we've got charity or not-for-profit, and at the other end we've got business or for-profit, and so you take this bit in the middle and say, oh, was that kind of where social enterprise means? And I like this in a sense in that it speaks to the intent of a charity and it speaks to the practice of a business, but it sort of implies that one end is good and the other is bad, and it also sort of implies that we have to compromise both of these things if we're going to do what we're trying to do, and that's just not actually what social enterprise is about. That's not real. So it's also really speaking about the organizational form. That's saying a charity versus a business, which are forms. They're not what you're kind of doing. So I find this framing quite unhelpful now. A lot of people misinterpret this quite drastically, and I think that's counter to what we're trying to achieve, so goodbye. Another approach is similar. You take a spectrum, and it's but it's more around value creation, so it's kind of similar in that you can say, all right, run in, we're doing stuff that's valuable for marginalized people, or the environment, or the community, like, creating some value for things that we perceive to be important. And at the other end, we're creating value for the economy. And again, it sort of implies a compromise of sorts, where we end up arguing about what counts as good and what counts as not. And yeah. So no, increasingly I'm like, no. So really where we're heading is back to some of the simple language from the 80s, the whole triple bottom line type thing. So social enterprise is essentially about creating value for people, and value can be interpreted in lots of different ways, as well as value for the environment, as well as value for the economy. It's kind of sticking all of these things together. And increasingly, I subscribe to the belief that, there's an argument about whether people or environment should be our core focus. People like to go back and forth on that. And I personally subscribe to the belief that we only care about the environment because it sustains us. Like, the environment will actually be fine. It'll be us that don't live. So really, it's about people. And we should be serving the environment so that we can serve ourselves. That's just how I view it. I don't really care if people want to argue, but it's just kind of how it works. But the point is that these three things are all interrelated. We can't separate out each of them, and so the notion that we're just working on community or just working on environment is nonsense. So we have to view all of these things as connected, and the way that the world's increasingly seeing that is through this notion of stacking them up like a wedding cake. So at the bottom we've got the biosphere. people working in the space recognize that we've got some very real planetary boundaries, things like carbon, water, energy. We've got huge balancing act of biodiversity and all these wonderful things that sustain us. And there are some very real challenges and deficits in our biosphere. We've done some wonderful stuff to our planet, and that needs to be rebalanced or rectified. So this is so very important because the biosphere is the foundation upon which our society stands. And without it, our society will crumble. So the wedding cake analogy starts to make sense. Society has no shortage of deficits also. We've essentially agreed as a global society to like a minimum expected quality of life. We've got things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We had the Millennium Development Goals, which spoke of a life of dignity for all. You know, we kind of know that we've got these baselines, and then we systematically break the baselines all over the world and do all these terrible things to each other. Now we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, which is like the largest co-created framework of thought in human history. Like we all agree on the most important things to us, and which I'll sort of come to in a second. And in a New Zealand context, we're currently exploring things like the Living Standards Framework, which is coming out of Treasury, which is kind of this sort of thinking, but in a New Zealand context. And then within our society, we've sort of realised over the centuries the value of having an arbitrary commodity that we can trade for mutual benefit to make society work better. So, you know, back in the day, I might have 50 fish and you make tables, and I need a table, but you don't like fish. So I'm like, well, here's this other thing in exchange for your table, and you can trade that for a haircut. And so we call it money. You know, not that you need a haircut, but it's just like, I can offer fish, not a haircut. So here's a thing instead. So that was really the basis of money. That's where money came from. It was like the economy was meant to just make our lives easier because like fish and tables are hard to trade back and forth. But it's no real secret that actually the economy doesn't necessarily always add value to humans' lives anymore. And so we've kind of gotten out of balance here. So you can see in each of these stacks of the wedding cake, we've got some deficits that need to be filled, and like the relationship between people in the biosphere and people in the economy. It's like there's just a bunch of stuff out of whack. And so social enterprise is just trying to realign that in a way that works for humans and the environment. And if we need the economy, then cool, let's do that also. But sometimes we don't. And that's okay as well. So some people don't like that because it's quite conceptual and difficult for some people to understand. So you whack in something a bit more tangible, like the Sustainable Development Goals. It gets a bit more real when you start talking about no poverty, or where's no poverty? In there somewhere, or sustainable production and consumption, or climate action. You know, people can wrap their heads around what we're talking about here with the Sustainable Development Goals. Around the world, heaps of countries have tried to solve. I'm just jumping forward in my notes. In New Zealand context, we don't have a definitive framework for what we count as social enterprise. If you're working towards these sorts of things, then you are a social enterprise, and if you're not, then you're not. We don't have that yet. Lots of countries around the world have tried to solve that problem. None of them have really cracked it in a way that's appropriate for contemporary society. They've all done a lot of really interesting stuff, but actually no one around the world has figured this stuff out yet, and I think that's the opportunity that we have in New Zealand at the moment. So there are a number of us looking at things like the Living Standards Framework, and that sort of appears to be the best contender at the moment for a way of defining some stuff and looking at what Stats NZ is doing with some of the indicators. Anyway, this is all stuff that people like Kate and I like to argue about, but that's... Anyway, so back to simplicity. So social enterprises create value. They create value for a customer. In the sense that you're trading goods and services, you're using materials from the earth and making use of the economy to make our lives easier. Pretty straightforward, and doing it in a way that adds value for the world, which is about the environment, the biosphere, and the sociosphere, and the economy to the extent that it's useful for us. So what I've been trying to do, I work in and with about 5 or 6 different social enterprises, and I've got some teaching roles. I've worked with about 300 people and organizations working in this space, and it's hard to wrap your head around in a simple way. So I spend a lot of time trying to figure out the ways that we can just put it forward and go, okay, I get that, so that we can get on and actually do the thing. Because it's really, really hard. It's kind of like what Sarah was saying, 95% of your time should be thinking before you go off and do the really, really hard stuff. This is all great. Does that kind of make sense in concept? Have I lost people? No? You keep nodding. I'm like, no. So how do people actually do it? Broadly speaking, an individual human will have one of 3 particular mindsets when they're approaching these things. Their main driver, the burning energy that makes them do things, will be one of these 3 things. They're either solving a problem, or they're doing some stuff, or they're trying to realize an opportunity. So I'll just jump into some examples. So if you take the problem-solving mindset, Aged Care UK, I think they're called Aged Care, I forget. there's a, whatever, doesn't matter, organisation in the UK who do a bunch of work supporting the elderly, and they recognised that the elderly community had this problem whereby they've got this increasingly international family, and they want to go and visit their family overseas, but they couldn't get access to travel insurance because of pre-existing medical conditions. And that has quite a significant impact on their quality of life. And so aged care partnered up with a insurance company, created a new product, sliced and diced things in a different way and made it work, created a new product, offered their travel insurance, solved the problem, made a bunch of income, which meant they could do more charitable stuff for the people that they're trying to serve. Quite clever. Very clear, identifiable problem. Let's solve it and let's make some money in the process. Boom. Here locally, we've got Kilmarnock. So Kilmarnock Enterprises provide skill development, wellbeing programs, and employment opportunities for school leavers with an intellectual disability. The problem they're solving is that society at large totally undervalues the contributions of people with disabilities, and as a result, they get left out in the cold. That's pretty much the problem that Kilmarnock's solving. People often frame it as the problem is that the person with the disability. It's not, it's everyone else. That's the bit that we keep getting wrong. And so Kilmarnock talk about being in the business of changing attitudes about disability, and they actively enable the required skills and opportunities for meaningful employment for people with disabilities. And their economic engine is that they're a contract manufacturer. It's kind of irrelevant, but they do a bunch of awesome stuff for big organisations and make money and provide skills. It's awesome. They're just a great organisation. But again, very clear, identifiable problem, and they exist to solve that problem, which is a very different approach, very different mindset to being an action mindset. So if we take someone like Tom's Shoes, Blake Mykoski was about my age when he started Tom's Shoes. He was traveling South America, saw a bunch of canvas shoes made and worn by the locals, and he thought, man, my mates in New York would buy those shoes. And he also saw a bunch of kids running around with bare feet. He's like, boom, I'm going to sell these shoes to my mates in New York and give some free shoes to the kids down here. Excellent. So he was totally driven by the thing that he wanted to do. It's now like a multi-billion-dollar organization. They work in doing eyewear and all sorts of things, kind of generally regarded as the founder of the one-for-one model, buy one, give one. And there are also an enormous amount of unintended consequences that came out of the back of Tom's Shoes, which, as they learned down the track, he wasn't really thinking about how this thing that he was doing affected the 3 layers of the cake. He just wanted to do the thing. And actually, this is where most people start when they get into the social enterprise journey in New Zealand. This is what I'm finding, is most people jump to this. A lot of people immediately jump to that. I'm going to do something over here that makes some money, and then I'm going to do some good over there, not realizing that actually making money, let alone surplus money, is quite difficult. So is doing good. And now you're trying to do both of them, and you haven't got any money yet. It's like, it's kind of the worst place to start, and it's also the easiest one to think of. So that's one of the challenges with this world of things. Yeah. Dangerous territory. I'm so over time. And then locally we have Felt. Full disclosure, I'm one of the sort of cooperative owner-operators of Felt. That's why I can speak about it. It's easy. So Felt was started 11 years ago by Lucy Arnold, who was hand sewing merino arm warmers, and she wanted an online outlet to sell them where they would actually be valued for what they are rather than just stacked up against mass-produced things. There wasn't really, this was pre-Etsy. This wasn't a thing. And so we're now an online marketplace. We're 11 years old. We support a community of about 3,000 or 4,000 creative makers and designers all around the country. They all sell their creative works through this one online platform. And we're driven by providing the marketplace for a particular type of thing. That's what we're about. It's like we're doing this thing, which is creating a marketplace for things that meet some certain conditions. But our impact areas, the problems that we're trying to soak up, are essentially around sustainable production and consumption, and employment opportunities for predominantly women, predominantly in rural areas. And there are considerable mental health benefits for creative people who just have to make for their own good and need to have an outlet and an income stream from that. I'm one of those people. So we facilitate the equivalent of about 13% of Creative NZ's contestable funding direct to artisan creatives rather than big box retailers. That's kind of the lever that we're trying to pull. And then, so you can see how the like doing things is kind of just a different mindset. You can soak up some problems in the process, but it's fundamentally about what you're doing. And then the last one is this value creation mindset, which is sort of my favorite one. I'm a bit of a fanboy of these sorts of things. So in the UK, there were a group of folks in the world of food, and they were looking at some amazing stats. There's things like, these are sort of, what's the word saying where you're saying it back? Paraphrasing, there we go. These are paraphrased, not specific, so don't quote me on them, but about 60% of produce grown is ploughed straight back into the dirt because it's too ugly to sell. Just think about that for a moment. More than half of the food that's grown is too ugly to sell, so they just put it straight back into the dirt. 40% of all bread that's baked in the UK never gets eaten, goes to landfill. Something like 40% of the 40% of produce that's pretty enough to sell, something like 40% of that doesn't actually ever get sold because it gets to its end of shelf life before it's sold, ends up in the landfill, expires on the shelves. And then at the same time, there are enormous numbers of people going hungry every day. It's just dumb, right? It's just dumb. Doesn't make any sense at all. And so these folks were like realizing imagining an opportunity. They said, well, imagine if all of our food and beverages were solving these problems instead of creating them. So just taking something that's completely imaginary and saying that, let's make that happen. That's a mindset that some people take, and it's amazing. So what they did is they take the waste bread, the 40% of bread that's never eaten, and they turn it into beer, and then they sell that beer under the name Toast, which is just the most brilliant marketing in the world. And they didn't want to be driving alcoholism because there are very real problems around alcohol. So what they did is they made it a premium brand, the likes of which don't get abused by the sections of society that are traditionally trapped by alcoholism. And then all of the profits from selling that beer at a premium to rich hipsters like me who go, man, that's awesome branding. All of the profits from that are given to a partner organization called Feedback, who take end-of-shelf-life food and turn it into meals for people who otherwise wouldn't have meals instead of it going into landfill. Right? Yeah. So these are the like super sophisticated social enterprises that exist. There are lots of them around the world. Really, 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 really hard to create from scratch. But when you do, boy, do they make a difference. Boy, do they move a needle. Locally, we've got Little Yellow Bird, which is run by a good friend of a number of us in the room, Samantha Ray Jones. Sam saw the considerable negative impacts of fast fashion. People are familiar with the concept of fast fashion. You can get the latest trends today for $4. Yeah, it's like, well, hang on. So unsustainable water use, desertification of previously fertile lands, use of forced and slave labor, impacts of heavy chemical use on farms and farmers, lots and lots of challenges created by the fast fashion industry. And then you stack the globalized credit-driven economy on top of that, and you start to see how there's just like this compounding effect that just systematically destroys things about our world and our society. And Sam Wood said, well, imagine if you could buy an item of clothing and have 100% certainty that that item of clothing was actually adding value to the world instead of like eroding it. Wouldn't that be nice? So it just so happens that she was a logistics and supply chain officer in the Air Force, and supply chain transparency is what she does, supply chain security. So she went off out of the military into the fashion industry and built an incredible, transparent, ethical supply chain, slapped a brand on the front of it and started selling ethical corporate clothing and uniforms. Clever cookie. And she's just actually raised $1.2 million to launch a new platform called Origins, which looks to essentially standardize and open up the excellence practices and transparency of her supply chain for other organizations. So you can see that these people have just sort of started not with looking at the problems that exist and saying, well, let's work backwards from there, but understanding the reality of the world and saying, all right, now imagine something better. Let's create that, and they're just bypassing all of these problems in the process. It's kind of just a different mindset. So I've gone well over time, but in summary, the opportunity is that social enterprise is a mindset and an activity. It's not like a structure. People talk about the social enterprise sector. It's not a sector. It's a way of operating that could be in any sector. But we sort of have to identify it as a thing before we can make it mainstream. It is for profit, and it is also good. We see these things as different things in New Zealand, but it is both, and that's okay. I personally believe that the people who are adding the most value to the world should also get paid the most. Right? Yeah. So why are we not making stacks and stacks of money saving the world? So anyone can do it at any time in any industry. It takes a lot of thinking first, and then a lot of work. It is very, very hard, and it's among the most meaningful things that one can do. Kia ora. Sorry for being so over time.